Here we go on chapter 3, part 2. When we left off, Eric had just been asked a slew of questions from his new classmates. And then the teacher came in. She had this weird stuffed frog on a stick, started class, and he turns around and sees that several of his classmates are not only napping, but actually brought like special pillows with them. So it was premeditated napping, is what he called it. How could this be? Eric had read all about the hard-working Koreans who trounced the Americans in math, reading, and science. He hadn't read anything about shamelessly sleeping through class. As if to compensate for his classmates, he sat up even straighter and waited to see what happened next. The teacher lectured on, unfazed. At the end of class, the kids woke up. They had a 10-minute break and made every second count. Girls sat on top of their desks or on overturned trash cans, chatting with each other and texting on their phones. A few of the boys started drumming on their desks with their pencils. They were strangely comfortable in the classroom, as if they were in their own living rooms at home. Next was science class. Once again, at least a third of the class went to sleep. It was almost frantical. How did Korean kids get those record-setting test scores if they spent so much of their time asleep in class? Soon he discovered the purpose of the teacher's back scratcher. It was the Korean version of wake-up call. Certain teachers would lightly tap kids on the head when they fell asleep or talked in class. The kids called it a love stick. At lunch, Eric followed the other students to the cafeteria and copied everything they did, filling up his tray with kimchi, a kind of spicy fermented cabbage that appeared at every meal in Korea, along with transparent noodles and what looked like vegetable and beef stew. He was relieved to see the Canadian and sat down with her to eat. It was a treat to have real, freshly cooked meal, not the warmed-up prefab entrees he got at Minnetonka. For the moment, sitting there in the warm cafeteria, twirling noodles with chopsticks, Eric felt as though he'd made the right decision in coming to Korea. The kids he'd graduated with were all starting college now. They'd bought their extra-long twin sheets at Bed Bath & Beyond and met their roommates. They were going to freshman writing seminars and fraternity parties. Eric had deliberately chosen to step off the treadmill. He'd spent 13 years in school and been politely bored much of the time. Like a lot of kids all over the world, he'd spent a lot of time staring at clocks, doodling in margins, and wondering whether this was all there was. For the last 2 years of high school, the International Baccalaureate program had challenged him in a way nothing else had, and it had reminded him how it felt to really learn, to think and discover things for the sake of discovery, not because it was what he was supposed to do. So after he'd gotten accepted into DePaul University in Chicago, he'd checked the box to defer. He'd wanted to live in Asia, to discover a totally different world in which he understood nothing at all whatsoever, and marinate in the strangeness for a while. Then he could come back and decorate a dorm room and let his life after high school begin. So lots of metaphors going on here. One good one was he had deliberately chosen to step off the treadmill. Obviously, he's not literally on a treadmill, but he's using this metaphor of what our expectations is for high schoolers heading out of high school and on to college, right? A lot of you have written about the expectations. You graduate from high school, you go to a 4-year college, and you have to go in this deliberate order. For those of you who are going to tech school or taking a gap year, it's a tough choice because it feels like you're taking a step in a different direction from other people. And in reality, there's many different choices, and all of them are good choices depending on your personality and how they fit your life. And so that's what he felt. He was stepping off of the treadmill. He was going off the beaten track, not following the expected path that all high schools are expected to follow. The Korean kids bolted down their food and then raced outside to claim the small amount of free time they had left. Some of the boys played soccer in the dirt, and a few of the girls sat on the steps and, hunched over their smartphones, logged on to SciWorld, which was like Facebook with more privacy controls. Eric was one of the last students to finish his food and leave the cafeteria. Between classes, Eric asked one of the other students about this test he kept hearing about, the one Korean high school seniors took before they graduated. "It's like your SAT in America," the boy told Eric, "except that your score determined the rest of your life. In Korea, your education can be reduced to a number, the boy explained. If your number is good, you have a good future. The highest score guaranteed acceptance into one of Korea's 3 most prestigious universities, and with that, you are destined for a good job, a nice house, and a lifetime of ease. Everyone would respect you. You were chosen by God, as another student put it, only half joking. But there was a problem. Only 2% of seniors got into those top 3 schools. So the exam was a choke point for the ambitions of millions of kids and their parents. Eric's classmates talked about this test with dread. They would spend the next 2 years of their lives studying, planning, and praying to do well on this test. Not one of them looked forward to it. Minnesota had a graduation test of its own. Eric had taken the math portion his junior year, but it was so easy that he couldn't imagine failing it. Kids who scored below the cutoff were automatically enrolled in a special class and allowed to retake the test again and again until they passed. So this is in the past. We don't have the same test anymore. It was the MCA's, but it was a different version of it. So it has gotten a lot more rigorous. So for those of you thinking that, no, it actually wasn't that easy, it's a new test, and it did get much more difficult. The Korean test, by contrast, was offered 1 day each year, and it was designed to be very difficult. Students who did poorly could take it again, but they had to wait a year. In Eric's next class, the teacher wrote each student's test score on the chalkboard, using ID numbers, not names. But all the kids knew each other's numbers. It was the first of many times that Eric would see his classmates publicly ranked. One girl put her head in her hands, and another just shook her head. Most of the tests at the school were graded on a curve, so only 4% of the kids could get the top score, regardless of how hard they worked. On and on went the hierarchy, all the way to 9th and worst possible score, which the bottom 4% of the class earned every time. Everyone in Eric's class knew everyone else's ranking, not just on this test, but on everything. The top 28 kids in the grade were the class heroes, and also the martyrs, because they had the most to lose. They worked hardest of all. At 2:10, Eric left school early. Since he was an exchange student, he was exempt from having to experience the full force of the Korean school day. He asked one of his classmates what would happen after he left. "We keep going to school." Eric looked at him blankly. "Until when?" "Classes end at 4:10, he said. Then he went on. After classes, the kids cleaned the school, mopping the floors, wiping the chalkboards, and emptying the garbage. The kids who had received demerits for misbehaving or letting their hair grow too long had to wear red pennies and clean the bathrooms. Work, including the unpleasant kind, was at the center of Korean school culture, and no one was exempt. At 4:30, everyone settled back in their seats for test prep classes, in anticipation of the college entrance exam. Then they ate dinner in the school cafeteria. After dinner came Yaya, a 2-hour period of study loosely supervised by teachers. Most kids reviewed their notes from the day or watched online test prep lectures as the teachers roamed the hallways and confiscated the occasional illicit iPod. Around 9 in the evening, Eric's classmates finally left Namsan, but the school day still wasn't over. At that point, most kids went to private tutoring academies known as hagwons. That's where they did most of their real learning, the boy said. They took more classes there until 11, the city's hagwon curfew. Then, finally, they went home to sleep for a few hours before reporting back to school at 8 the next morning. What do you think of that schedule? Eric listened to this epic regimen with a mounting feeling of dread. How could teenagers do nothing, literally nothing, but study? Suddenly he understood what he had seen in class that day. The kids had acted like they lived in the classroom because they essentially did. They spent more than 12 hours there every weekday, and they already went to school almost 2 months longer than kids back in Minnesota. His classmates slept in their classes for one primal reason, because they were exhausted. Suddenly, Eric wanted very badly to leave early. By 2:15, he and the Canadian girl were walking across the dirt field, headed away from Namsan, 7 hours before their classmates could leave. While the Korean kids worked, the exchange students went into a convenience store. Eric noticed an ice cream bar made with red bean paste molded into the shape of a fish. He bought it, hoping it wouldn't taste like fish. It didn't. It tasted like vanilla. Around 2:30, he caught the bus back home. The Korean kids kept working. Lying on his bed back at his host family's apartment, Eric thought more about what the boy had told him. Korean kids essentially went to school twice every weekday. He had found one possible explanation for Korea's PISA scores, and it was depressing. Kids learned a lot, but they spent a ridiculous amount of time doing so. They had math classes at school and math classes in Hagwons. He was astounded by the inefficiency of it all. In Korea, school never stopped. Staring out the window at the city, he recalibrated. Before he'd left the United States, he had thought that American schools did too much standardized testing and put too much pressure on kids and teachers. Everyone seemed to be complaining about tests and overprogrammed kids. Now, thinking back on the rhetoric about high-stakes testing and stressed-out kids, Eric almost laughed. American tests were not high stakes for students. In fact, the stakes couldn't have been much lower, especially for standardized tests. The consequences, if there were any, extended mostly to the adults who worked in the school. Their school might, for example, be labeled in need of improvement by the federal government, and in a few places, a small fraction of teachers with extremely low scores might eventually lose their jobs. But for most kids, standardized tests were frequent, unsophisticated, and utterly irrelevant to their lives. Even regular classroom tests did not mean as much in the United States as they did in Korea. If kids did poorly in the United States, there was always a caveat. The test was unfair, or that's okay, not everyone can be good at math. In Korea, the lesson was cleaner. You didn't work hard enough, and you had to work harder next time. He started to realize that pressure was a relative term, and so was testing. From what Eric had seen so far, Namsan seemed designed to convey, through austere classrooms and brutal hierarchies, one message: that kids' futures depended not on their batting averages, their self-esteem, or their Facebook status, but on how hard they worked to master rigorous academic material. Was this what it took, he wondered, to score at the top of the world on international tests? If so, Eric wasn't sure he'd want to be the number one. And that's where we'll stop for the day.